So we have such a long title because you get 2 presentations for the price of 1 today. So I'll start and tell about our project and experiences with Angular in building the new beta site, the upcoming site that will eventually replace the current Finnair.com site. And on the later half of the speak, Olli will tell about measurement and analytics related to the same project. So the beta.finnair.com is already in production use. It's built in Angular and it's currently being used by mobile users, so that's why we still have it at beta and not the main site. It's fully decoupled solution from CMS, so there's a JSON API that provides the content, and then we render it to templates in Angular into a site. The architecture is a modern microservice-based architecture that we run on top of the Amazon cloud. And we already have 55 language variants up and running. There are many English variants, but local languages, including Japanese and Chinese variations as well. The backend is provided by Amadeus, so there is an API that we integrate to, and they provide all the travel-related APIs to us. And all our code is on GitHub. We use Node and Java, and for continuous deployment we have Travis and Jenkins. And for the global content delivery we use Akamai in front of all this. The design model we have is hypothesis-driven design, which means that instead of just designers making an educated guess and developers implementing and immediately deploying it, the designers now only get to do hypothesis. And then that is tested with real customers, both at the Finnair office and at the airport. So we have permission from Finavia to also interview people who are actually traveling, and that's a really great way for us to reach the target group. It's a multi-vendor team, so there are Finnair's own designers and developers in the team, as well as multiple consultants. Me and Olli are from Frantic, but we work in the same team together, and there are like no vendor borders or anything. We're just one team at Finnair. If you think about the approaches, how you can implement a site that has both content, a lot of content, and then has functionalities, in this case a booking engine where people actually go to buy their tickets and ancillaries. There are 4 approaches to approach a problem like this. So, of course, if you don't have any functionalities, you can have just CMS-generated pages and output them to the users. And then you can place a client-side application inside such a page on the second one. And that's quite common use if most of the site is content, and then you have just like a widget to ask for information or whatever. The third option is then to run the whole thing as a client-side application and fetch the content inside it. And of course the fourth option, which is also available, would be that you don't have any CMS content. So if it's like Gmail or something like that that doesn't have any publishable content, then the fourth one would be the natural pick. But since we wanted to have a seamless UX flow, we picked the third one. So we drive the whole experience with Angular and load things through the JSON API for the users. And the project started late 2015, and this was actually the beta announcement from the Angular team, as they wrote it at time. But either they were very optimistic or strong in their beliefs, because I think that this is what it should have said at the time. It wasn't ready, but the best developers were able to start building things with it. It wasn't ready for production use at the time when we started to use it. And yeah, we did know it, but I wanted to reflect on our experiences, and this is the like promise list of the core team from early 2016. And the first promise was that there will be speed and performance. And while that was true, but only after you got the thing loaded into the client side. So there were megabytes of JavaScript, and we even tested it on top of an existing site, and there was so much JavaScript that the older Internet Explorers choked on it and gave a Stack Overflow error immediately. There was no Angular universal, so you had to load everything before you were able to start rendering the experience for the users. And the second promise of simple and expressive, well, there was no documentation, so I don't think that it was that simple. The text that you wrote was expressive, true, but it wasn't that simple to write when there was no documentation. Okay, well, then all developers, of course, go to Stack Overflow, but everything that was there was practically false or expired because Angular was developing so fast. So what our developers ended up most of the time doing was looking into the actual Angular code and seeing what the interface is and how it should be used. That produced, of course, a steep learning curve. You had to know how things work, and the terminology wasn't documented widely yet. But we made do. The effort to create new components was also a bit tricky. You had to add it into multiple places, and the CLI didn't exist yet, so you had to create it all by hand and hook it into the index files and require it in the right places. Comprehensive routing was one of the promises too. Well, that's true if you have an application that doesn't have changing paths and changing content all the time. But since we wanted to have the ahead of time compilation that came available later, and the site is huge with all these language versions, the routing is really tricky to implement. The legacy browser support was also promised, and yeah, it was there if you don't put too much other JavaScript stuff on top of that. But that's practically bygones by now, because the PCI requirements that the credit card companies impose on e-commerce sites will by this summer require the turn off of TLS 1.0 and 1.1, and that means that the old IE will not even be able to connect to the site, so they will never see any Angular code anymore. And that means that it's bygones. Of course, Microsoft has also discontinued them, but if someone is still using them after the June changes to July, they will not be able to connect to most of the sites anymore. Our current challenges are a bit different, so that routing thing with all the ahead of time compilation and large amounts of content is still something that we're working on. And the unzipped 2 megabytes of JavaScript is not that small. Luckily, also the mobile clients are quite fast in running up the code, and it's about 400 kilobytes at the moment when the client loads it, zipped to it. The learning curve is still a bit steep, so you have to learn a lot of Angular terminology and understand RxJS before you can be productive. And we've also learned that the Zone.js issues are often painful to debug. If something gives an error about Zone.js, then that's a jump into the rabbit hole to investigate how to fix that one. When the project started in the late 2015, I was the Scrum Master of the project and felt a bit like Mr. Bean in this picture. So the project started with CMS and vendor evaluation by Finnair. We were part of that. And then Finnair created a digital service blueprint, which means that there is a path of the customer journey that customers will do, and we know what touch points they are most probably going to use when they are at that step of the travel. At the early 2016, there was a separate mock-up design prototype created in London about the booking experience alone and how to search the flights. And then in the spring of 2016, we started the actual project and started building the thing with Angular. The next summer, we released an internal private beta with mobile destinations, but that wasn't public yet, so that was our first milestone to have it up and running with real content and an integrated CMS. At the same time, Angular released the release candidate, and a bit later the version 2 came. With that one, we published the first public beta, so their users were able to search for their flights and choose the flights, but after that they were transferred to a legacy system to complete the purchase. And after 2017 launch, the Angular version 4 was released, and I think that was the first real what Angular 2 was marketed to me version, so 4 was what was promised to be in number 2. And with that one, we released the full mobile booking flow last summer, and that means that the user from end to end was able to buy their plane tickets after browsing the destinations. And that one then we extended late last year with all the language versions and destinations, and around Christmas time we also extended it so that users can buy their bags and meals in the same booking flow. And the reason why Finnair built this thing is, of course, that Finnair wants to control the user experience for their customers. So instead of just taking some off-the-shelf product and then changing the colors and putting your logo on top of it, they want to be able to control the user flow and customize all the steps that customers take so that they meet Finnair's offering and are easy, and of course also they are part of the experience when people travel. So why we do love Angular in a large team like this? Angular is expressive, and when there is less lines of code, that practically means less bugs to write. TypeScript's typing also prevents errors because you know what you are expecting on the other end of the function call and what you give as parameters there. And Angular also encourages modular components, so people are quite natural to write one thing into one component instead of we ending up with massive classes of things that do multiple things. Also, the automated testing of components is quite well built in, so that is a really beneficial for us and for front-end developers who handle the templates. It's really nice that you can write the templates isolated and have the isolation of the styles for that component, and you don't need to worry about names overlapping with other class names. Dependency injections are really cool, and the React.js is also essential for us. The takeaways, what we've learned so far is that you should validate your designs with real users. It brings up better results, and even when we have really professional and experienced designers, there are always some things that some user will think differently, and this exposes those things early on. Framework saves time when you're creating a new service like this, so there's less things to discuss and agree on when you want to start fast. Framework provides most of those things already thought out for you. You should do fat microservices. By fat microservices, I mean that you should put all the business logic into the microservices instead of pushing them to the client. This way you can use the same microservice on multiple touchpoints. Your mobile app can use the same, and in Finnair's case even the in-flight systems can use the same APIs, and you don't need to change the business logic in multiple places if you do it this way. And of course, when the transfer speeds are always limited and speed is essential for the users, you should give thin responses. So fat microservice processes everything, crunches it so that it's ready for the user, and then you only give what is needed in the response, nothing extra. And you can also mangle it so that it's in the proper data format for the client to consume, so that they don't need to join multiple sources of data there. We join often in one microservice data from 3 or even 4 places into just one response. Minimize the client-side business logic. As said, put all in the server side. It's just easier for you and easier to do changes, easier to measure. Write tests, a lot of tests. We do that, and it's really comforting for the developer who changes something, because they can immediately see if they caused any side effects or if it was what they intended, and then it's intentional if tests need to be updated. PRs, peer review, pull requests in human language. So every time a developer does a change, another developer has a look, and we've learned that both the person who reviews them learns about the other person's thinking and the other way around. So it's beneficial for both. We don't have much of hierarchy there, but most often the most experienced ones do most of the reviews, but sometimes 3 persons review the code and just learn from that change. TypeScript is awesome. It makes things clean and also helps the developers to think about the logical objects as different types, so it helps with the thinking too, not just making sure that there are no bugs in the interfaces. And in practice, you will need to abandon V and Emacs and use a proper development environment, because while you can open a lot of files and close and navigate around them, it will be so much more productive when you can do that in an environment that immediately compiles and tells if some syntax is not there. You don't need to wait for another screen to tell that there was an error on line 57, please fix it. And our results. So compared to the previous booking flow that Finnair has for mobile users, the ticket sales have almost doubled. And the booking flow conversion is up more than 400%. And since we are now able to show those ancillaries, meaning meals and bags, in a much better way for the users than what we were able to do with the previous product, the ancillary sales is up more than 700%. So the results have been already quite well received. And how do we get numbers like this? Well, there's tracking and analytics to solve that, and my colleague Olli from Frantic will tell you more about that. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, I'm Olli, and one of Okko's takeaways was to evaluate your designs with real users, and this is something that will help you with that, of course. Of course, we want to know what is going on in the application and maybe use this data to feed it back to the designers for new iterations and so forth. We have been tracking whole flow quite early on, just because of this. But the implementation of tracking was such a late feature that I can actually now explore how it is to develop things with Angular after these challenges we have passed, and now Angular should be expressive and simple to use and easy to test. So let's see how you set up tracking and what kind of benefits Angular can provide us out of the box. Maybe you are a developer new to the team and you don't know the project exactly, but you know how to use Angular. So let's see what is tracking in high level. We are using Google Analytics for our tracking needs. That's good to point out here. Basically, this is what you end up doing in a basic tracking setup. You track page views, of course, and custom events of all sorts. That is basically whatever your business domain requires you to track. But let's explore UI events, especially in this case. Then, of course, what I labeled business stuff here. So everything related to money, basically your e-commerce funnels, goals, stuff like that. So this is the basic pile of things. Let's get back to the page views. Usually you are tracking page views when a new page loads to the browser and you are sending event that now it happened. But of course we are using Angular as a single page application, so that doesn't work. But I know that Angular ships with the router, even though I don't know anything about the projects. And I know that the router will know when the page is changing. So in RxJS world, I know that I can subscribe to this router most likely and get the information there. So we will use router for the page views. Then we are left with custom events. So in this case, custom events, let's say we want to validate a new feature for our designers. Is it performing well, or do we need to make some changes? So let's get even more specific here. Let's say that we have a list of items and we want to validate how the list position and the content of the list item affects how it gets clicked, for example. I know out of the box that Angular has directives and especially attribute directives. This is out-of-the-box way, really easy way to implement something on demand on a component that we can use to supply information onwards. With directive, you can easily utilize the existing event bindings on the component, and you can specify some needed data and context for your tracking via inputs of the directive. So it sounds like we can use a directive there and maybe make a generic solution that we can deploy on any component we want to track. Of course, we don't want to track all of the buttons, everything. We want to minimize the data and make it most usable. So we want something that we deploy only on demand. Business stuff. Well, in our project, we are lucky to have chosen to use ngRx store. And when you are using Redux type of data flow, you know that basically everything important in your application will be in the application state. So even though I don't know much else of the project at this point, I know that most of the stuff should be in the state of the application, especially if it's to do with payments, maybe what is the payment status and items in the cart and stuff like that. So I know that when I'm tapping into the store at the right moment, I should be able to get this data off as well. So we have a basic set of data being tracked already without knowing anything much of the specific project. Then, of course, we need something to forward this data onwards. And, of course, we will use a service that will format this data and send it wherever we need. In our case, we are using Google Tag Manager to integrate Google Analytics to the application, which basically means that all that our service needs to do is it will be sending events and data objects to a global array, and Google Tag Manager will then read this array and react to these events and then imply tracking scripts utilizing this data. So this is the whole setup already without knowing much else than that we are using Angular and the store in the application. Next up, we can go a little bit closer and see how we achieve these things in code level then. Let's first talk about the tracking service. It does nothing, by which I mean that it does quite a lot, but it doesn't alter the state of the application in any way. This is just a service that will be reading stuff from the application. So basically, it is supplying specific functions that we do by events. For example, page we have UI event, flight checkout, or flight search, or stuff like that. And these functions will be then spread across the application, and they will minimize and format the data and ultimately push it to this global array that the Google Tag Manager then can read. So quite simple service in this case. Then I mentioned the router for the page views. Well, we know that you can actually subscribe to the events of the router by using just normal observables ways of working. So in this case, we can just filter out event of types navigation end, which means that the router has finished navigating to a new route. And in our case, we are also throttling this a bit to evade like fast page changes and only take the ones that are relevant to us. And then ultimately send this data to the tracking service that will format it. Quite simple stuff. Then I mentioned the store. The store is really handy for a person who wants to know what is going on in the application. We have few methods of tapping into the store and using what is there. Basically, you can use let operator just like you would in any other observable flow to actually access the specific values inside the store. And that way you can know when something changes in the store and you can trigger event again in the service. Another maybe cleaner way to do this nowadays is also imply side effects of the ngRx store, which means that you have a clean way of when you know that the specific action that maybe sets a payment status or cart items in the application, when that action fires, we can figure out that now we need to fire a side effect that will then push this data payload of the action back to the service again. So in theory, this is kind of pseudocode example, but it looks like this. So once again, you will be working on with observables and data streams. So a good thing of Angular is that RxJS is everywhere, and basically just knowing some of it, you have quite powerful tools of tapping into all kinds of data inside the application. Then I mentioned the directive for tracking UI events, and this is mainly now talking about just the UI events. You might end up having all kinds of custom events. But yeah, not everything updates the store and the state of the application. Let's maybe have an example of you have a button that has a click binding, and the click binding fires, but some condition is not in such way that anything goes forward from that point. Maybe you just click it and nothing happens. So the store is not updating with the new state. However, if there is a click handler on the component that was clicked, the attribute directive can use the host listener, and we still will know that the event fired. So we can use that to supply data to the attribute directive and forward it onwards. I mentioned briefly the use case that maybe we would want to track a list item, and in this case we have flight searches and the flight selection after you have inputted all the parameters. So maybe we want to know how the technical stops in the flight affect the conversion rate, and also what is the list position of this element and how does that affect all of this. So with the directive, you can basically attach it to the component, or in this case, it's just a normal button node. But you can supply inputs to this directive, and by using the host listener on the existing event bindings that the component has, in this case, it has a click method. So we can use that to fire actually, again, a function from the tracking service and send the data there. So with these, we have figured out already in quite simple measures how you can quite expressively track all of the key components of your application. Of course, there will be some edge cases and, for example, timing functions and enhanced e-commerce stuff and stuff like that, but you should be able to find that from the store. And even if you are not using the store, then you can still tap into your services and subscribe there to all of the key critical parts of the application, but that will be more work. Well, in conclusion, router is really nice for the page view tracking and easy. The store is also lovely if you are using it in your project, and I would say that in a bigger scale project it has really been beneficial because it's one centered place for new developers to look for the stuff that might be happening, and everything goes through that. Directives were really useful for the UI tracking, and the service ultimately just formats the data and pushes it forward. One final extra benefit of using Angular and TypeScript is that when you have made your functions in the service that format the data and send it forward, you are utilizing some models and interfaces there anyway. So you can use these to make some specification for your analyst people who are using the tag manager. So they already know by looking at the docs what data is available and with what event. So this is basically ready-made documentation for you. So that covers the key parts of tracking such application. And the application, as Okko mentioned, is already live. You can go check it out. It's kind of just a mobile flow at this point, even though you can see it with the desktop. Also, Finnair and Frantic are both recruiting, so maybe have a look at there if you want to join adventures like this. And if you have any questions on maybe more complex tracking scenarios or anything like that, maybe even GDPR, which is a big elephant in the room, just come to talk to us later. Thank you.